Hi, this time I'm going to talk about the 2009 film Solomon Kane. This is the DVD that you can usually find here in Mexico. As you can see, the title says Cazador de Demonios, which translates to Demon Hunter. They gave it that flashy title because a lot of people here in Mexico do not know who Solomon Kane is. So that way, some people that are looking for like a dark fantasy movie, they could still potentially enjoy the film based on Solomon Kane being like a hunter or pursuer of evil. If you haven't seen my video where I talk about Solomon Kane, Conan the Barbarian, and Robert E. Howard, I'm going to put the link to that video in the description below so you can check that out. That video is not necessary to understand the content of this video, but I still recommend that you check that out. And this video, I'm going to avoid spoilers. I'm just going to talk a bit about the background of the main character and some things about the basic plotline or premise. I'm going to start with what I dislike of the movie. And there are just a few things that I dislike. In general, I really love this movie. I think it's very decent considering, for example, the most recent Conan the Barbarian film. I didn't like that one at all. I enjoy it as a separate movie that is as a barbarian, that it has nothing to do with Conan, but I don't think it's a good Conan film. But in the case of this film, Solomon Kane, I think it represents the character quite well, all things considered. But here are my general dislikes. First, I'll start with a nitpick. There are some lines, some parts of the dialogue that I feel were a bit unnecessary. Something that a villain says or that Solomon Kane says, that it feels like it was a bit too forced, that they just added that particular line to highlight the heroism or virtue of Solomon Kane, or something that Solomon Kane says that you know that it's just there to highlight a bit more of the drama or his personal conflicts. But I think some of those things could have been avoided. There are some really good lines as well, but it's just that very small percentage, perhaps 5% or less, just to give you a number of the dialogue that I thought that it was a bit too cheesy and not in a charming way. The other thing that I disliked, and this is probably my biggest dislike of the film, is that one of the monsters that Solomon Kane fights against, it seems like it came from World of Warcraft. It looks like a video game monster. The design doesn't make too much sense. In general, I would have preferred more practical effects. There are a lot of computer effects, and that's one of the worst ones that I've seen, just mainly because of the design, and it seems so out of place compared to the other monsters that you see in the film and the other threats. The other thing that I disliked is that some parts of the battles or of the combat, they seem unrealistic. And I know this is supposed to be a bit more on the over-the-top side of things, but there are some pretty cool pulpy-looking battles that really remind you of when Robert E. Howard was first writing The Adventures of Solomon Kane, but they sometimes do some cuts to certain camera angles that it slows the battle down, and not in a sort of like a bullet time sort of way. No, it feels like they interrupt the fluidity of the combat. So you're going to see Solomon Kane fighting, and suddenly they cut to this section of the fight where he's like cutting the limb of someone, and they feel the arm or the head, if I'm not mistaken. It's been a few like about a year since I saw it, and he cuts the leg or the arm or the head or something, and they cut to that segment, and it feels like the battle is interrupted. It should be a bit more fluid. Because of the original stories of Solomon Kane, you know that Solomon Kane is highly proficient in swordplay, and he's a very good shootist too. But sometimes they try to highlight that by exaggerating some of his moves, some of his flourishes seem a bit out of place and unrealistic as well. Sometimes he exposes his back to his enemy. You could say, oh, maybe like he's performing like sort of like a feint, but it felt too exposed in my opinion, too unrealistic. In fact, there is a part in one of the battles where a bad guy can basically kill Solomon Kane, and he just wounds him when he could have killed him. You could argue that maybe he's a bit sadistic and just wanted to like hurt Solomon Kane, but it still felt too unrealistic in my opinion. Like he wouldn't have wasted time to do that particular villain. But despite that, the battles are pretty good. This is just my criticism of some of the segments during each of the fights. The fights, the character of Solomon Kane fights in the style that you see in the original Robert E. Howard stories. He's an expert dual wielder. He's usually fighting with two weapons, one weapon in each hand. Maybe he's using a sword and a dagger, or maybe he's using two pistols. That's the way Solomon Kane fights. He also does these like little flourishes with his cape. When he has to engage to hand, he's also quite brutal and knowledgeable as well. So I think that's really good of the battles, but sometimes I do feel that those unnecessary moments where the camera cuts to this angle so you can see Solomon Kane chopping off a limb and he exposes himself too much, or sometimes the enemy attacks and you can see that it's part of the choreography. It doesn't feel like that attack is going to strike a definitive blow, and it's just there to so the character can parry the attack or dodge it or whatever. So, but nonetheless, the fights in general, I like them. The other thing that I disliked, I think that's about it actually. Just those three things: that the extra dialogue, the bad guy that looks like something out of World of Warcraft, and some of the fights in Solomon Kane that they feel a bit interrupted, or that the fluidity of the combat is interrupted or cut off as well. Now I'm going to talk about the main plotline of this film. Robert E. Howard didn't give us too much to work with when it comes to the background of Solomon Kane. You only get some bits and pieces in the original stories. Perhaps one of the most important clues when it comes to the home of Solomon Kane in the story Solomon Kane Homecoming, if I'm not mistaken, that's the title. You can see some of the background of Solomon Kane when it comes to the moodiness or the melancholy of his background story. So here in the film they have to expand upon that, build upon that, and that is a very challenging thing in my opinion. So here they present Solomon as someone of noble blood. You can see some of his problems being a child of a noble house. You can see how his brother is quite different from him. I would consider him a bad person. He's not exactly like sort of noble that actually cares for his people. He's exploiting his position as a nobleman. So many things happen during Solomon Kane's childhood. He also does not get along too well with his father because of what he expects Solomon Kane to do. That is sort of like his duty. So a really bad tragedy happens, and Solomon Kane is forced to flee from his home. And then the movie goes further as to when Solomon Kane is now sort of like a mercenary captain. The general ambience and mood or setting of the film reminds me a bit of Le Pacte de Loups. If you haven't seen my video of that film, I recommend that you check it out. I'm going to put the link in the description below as well. They happen at different sections of the timeline, if I'm not mistaken. Solomon Kane occurs between the late 16th century and early 17th century. So now you can see this adult Solomon Kane. He's probably one of the best, if not the best, sword fighter and gunfighter of his time. You can see that he is very ruthless. His lifestyle, because he escaped his noble household, he is now a very rough, perhaps even at times cynical type of character, or sadistic also. He has mastered the blade and the gun, and he's quite cocky about it. You can see how he almost toys around with his enemies, and he takes great pleasure in torturing them in one way or the other. So Solomon Kane decides to assault this place in Africa, if I'm not mistaken. I think that's also a good reference to the short stories, that Solomon Kane usually travels to Africa. And he finds a stronghold, or sort of like a castle, of some sort of vile sorcery. Some sort of rites and ceremonies are carried out within it. And because of his greed, Solomon Kane pushes forward deeper into this place with his men, and he falls into the trap. He basically is now under threat by the devil himself. The devil wants Solomon Kane's soul, and in true sword and sorcery fashion, he manages to escape that confrontation, because it was quite difficult for Solomon Kane to win against the entity that he was fighting there. And but he ends up scarred or traumatized by the ordeal. He is now terrified for the fate of his soul. And this is where I would consider a bit of the downfall in that particular moment of Solomon Kane. That is, this is not this is just a temporary thing. But you can see how Solomon Kane becomes diseased because he becomes a very religious individual. Just like in Le Pacte de Loups, you can see Europe that is ravaged by different, like a transition between religions. You can see the conflict of paganism on one side and Christianity on the other, and people caught between those two forces. And Solomon Kane, sadly, because he had that confrontation with demonic energies, he thinks that he can only find refuge in Christianity. So he becomes really paranoid. He abandons his fighting potential or ability completely, because killing is bad. Even if they kill you, forget about your ability to survive and saving yourself and others. No, killing is bad. So he thinks he is going to further damn himself. He keeps spends most of the time locked inside his sort of like a room, because he basically donates all of his riches that he's obtained as a mercenary captain. He gives it all to the church, and they gave him this sort of like a small cell-like room. He's surrounded by pages of the Bible that has placed all over the walls and windows. He's afraid for he's terrified of falling into damnation. He has also tattooed his body with symbols and marks that will probably, he hopes, keep the demonic forces at bay. But one of the monks or priests in that temple that he's staying at, he supposedly obtained some sort of revelation telling him that Solomon Kane needs to leave the monastery. Funny enough, they do not give him back the money that he spent. That's basically kicking him out after he paid rent or gave enough money to purchase a room in that place. So that seems a bit they were a bit not very nice of them. So Solomon Kane goes out into the world, but because he has this twisted notion that he can move through life without killing or hurting others, especially in those moments, in that particular time where the commoners were attacked by highwaymen and bandits and evil priests and sorcerers and such. You can see some awful moments, some, I guess you could say, cringe-worthy moments where Solomon Kane could have taken care of some evil guys, and instead of, oh, I'm not going to be a bad person, I'm going to let them do whatever they like with me, and he gets punished for it, and he ends up in trouble. But eventually he finds sort of like a refuge or help. There he receives help from a family that is traveling as well. Sadly, they are also a bit into that religious outlook, and you can see how Solomon Kane starts to regain his old self, but in a more virtuous or tempered way. Solomon Kane will be forced to retake or recover his old fighting spirit, but this time he has a more virtuous purpose. He notices that there is great evil in the world, and he is probably one of the few that can actually fight against this evil. Although in typical Robert E. Howard fashion, you kind of see Solomon Kane as the only one capable of fighting against all that evil. And to avoid spoilers, something terrible is going to happen while Solomon Kane is traveling with that family. A lot of you will probably imagine what happens. And in his great naiveness, Solomon Kane actually tries to talk with the bad guys. And because he decided not to kill, something really bad happens. And this is when Solomon Kane returns to his old self, but it's more like a rebirth, because now he's not like the cocky mercenary king, now he is the righteous warrior ready to punish. So there's a really cool line where he's basically talks at God, like, oh, this is what you want for me? Well, okay, I don't care if I am damned, I'm going to do what's right. And when you see Solomon Kane fighting, despite what I told you, that some of the things that I do not like of battle, it's awesome, amazing. He's ruthless, merciless. He's quite different from Conan the Barbarian. Conan the Barbarian usually overpowers his opponents. He's usually way better than them when it comes to stamina, speed, and strength. But Solomon Kane, he is somewhat of a dirty fighter at times, I would say, and also more finesse-like in his approach. So he starts slashing and cutting and thrusting in an amazing way. And there's a really cool part where he's going on his horse. There are some chase scenes, and he basically shoots at each side with his pistols. Looks really amazing. And that's when the film gets really exciting. You see Solomon Kane traveling through this countryside that is quite gloomy, and there are a lot of grim, dark elements, with a purpose now, and to rescue a certain someone. A lot of you that have already read the Solomon Kane stories, you can probably identify there is sort of like a trope or the standard victim that Solomon Kane is trying to help or rescue. You can see that in this film. And Solomon Kane is going to fight against all sorts of enemies. He's going to fight bandits, cultists, deranged priests, anything you can imagine, supernatural enemies as well. There is a lot of sorcery going on, despite keeping things being kept a bit low fantasy, because sometimes you can see the evil in a very palpable way. You can also see Solomon Kane throughout the film at different moments as a true leader of men, fighting at the front, not just being like some charismatic guy that go onwards and I'll stay here safe. No, he's leading his men. And you can also see part of the clash or the conflict between Solomon Kane being a complete Puritan and seeing that there are some magical or energies or mysteries in the world that are not tied to a particular religious notion of good and evil. In fact, in one part of the movie, he receives help from magic or some sort of sorcery that he would consider unlawful or ungodly. I think that's great. That goes a lot with the theme of the original stories. So that's basically it when it comes to the basic storyline. I could say a lot of more things, but it would spoil many of the plot twists of the movie. Even though the plot in general is straightforward, there are just a couple of things that maybe some people will not expect them. I identified one of them when I first saw the film, the other one I did not expect. But so overall, I really like the 2009 film Solomon Kane. It's a really fun movie. Do not expect to find like a complete masterpiece, but it's a really fun film of a dark fantasy film with grim dark elements. You're going to see disease, death, many moments where good people die, when there is a lot of ruthlessness, and Solomon Kane is the only force that can battle against these demonic threats. I really hope they didn't. I would have liked it if they didn't use that monster that I told you about. That looks like out of a video game. It clashes a lot with the feeling of Solomon Kane, with the mood of his stories. Funny enough, I think one of my favorite parts of the movie is when the credits start to roll, because they have a bit of like a montage or choreography where you can see that Solomon Kane is now a completely dedicated vigilante or hunter of evil, because this movie is basically like the origin story of Solomon Kane. And when the credits start to roll and you can see Solomon Kane moving around and fighting all sorts of villains, it feels so cool, like the story has just begun. Because Solomon Kane has that obsession of punishing evil, because as he said in one of the stories, it is his destiny to hunt rogues such as those or them, those that perform vile sorceries and sacrifices and try to hurt people and have nefarious plans for the world. That's Solomon Kane, moving between Africa and different parts of Europe. He's pretty amazing, one of my favorite characters in all fantasy, and I think they did a pretty good job in taking those clues, those hints that Robert E. Howard left for us when it comes to the background of Solomon Kane. You actually think that it solidifies some aspects of the character. That is, if you read the Solomon Kane stories after watching this film, you will not feel a strong disconnection between the character in the movie and the character in the stories. I think you will identify that character as the same type of warrior. So I highly recommend that you watch this film. Well, thanks for watching this video. If you have any comments or questions, please let me know. See you later.